While others are joining us, I'll just do a quick introduction. For those who haven't met me, I'm Ellie Hopwood from Farmer Pack. On behalf of the Environment Committee, I'd like to welcome everyone here for the second series in our Lunch and Learns with Barbara Nebel from Thinkstep. So once again, thanks so much, Barbara, for making yourself available, especially that you're on the road today down in usually sunny Turingi. Look, we're all very excited, Barbara, about getting into this webinar of Carbon 101. So if you'd like to take it away. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ellie, Sandy, Kelly, and the team at Plastics New Zealand. It's really a pleasure to be here. I had the pleasure to actually meet Ellie and Sandy in person yesterday, and we talked briefly through this presentation, and we decided to keep it really Carbon 101. I've seen quite a few of you before, so I'll go straight in with not all carbon is bad, because we need carbon fiber for things like very cool bikes, but also for renewable energy. The blades of wind turbines are made from carbon fiber. So per se, carbon can be a really good thing. I think it's about 17 or 19% of our body is carbon. So clearly we cannot really miss out on carbon. And then of course, trees. 50% of the weight of a tree is actual carbon. And there is a lot of carbon stored in the soil as well. And that is in agricultural soil as well. So any organic matter really is up to half carbon, and that stores carbon. And trees actually suck carbon dioxide out of the air as well. So I just thought I'd start with not all carbon is bad, because it sort of has become a bit of a negative word. I thought I'd introduce a few general terms that are around. We talk about the greenhouse gas effect, we talk about global warming, we talk about all those different terms, but what do they actually mean? And they actually are in an order. So the greenhouse gas effect actually means we have a layer of gases around the globe that keep the warmth in. So during the day, we get sunlight in, and then we've got a layer around the globe that lets the sunlight, the warmth and the energy of the sunlight in. Everyone experiences that. If we have a cloudy night, it's generally warmer. And then we have those really crisp, clear nights. And that is because we don't have the clouds to keep the warmth in. So one of the most potent and most abundant greenhouse gases actually is water vapor, as in our clouds. And it works the same way as the greenhouse gas effect. So at the moment, the greenhouse gas effect really is only keeping the energy close to the Earth, which leads to global warming, which is the next term that is quite often used. So they're not quite interchangeably, it's one leading to the other. And the more the Earth warms up, that'll have an impact on how winds are changing, how flows of ocean are changing that take different temperatures to different parts of the world, and that causes climate change. And that is really what we have. If it was just the greenhouse gas effect without the flow on to making it warmer, without the flow on effect to climate change, we wouldn't have so much of a problem. But climate change really is more than just it becoming warmer. It is about having extreme weather events and having lots of those. I just thought I'd put those terms into order because they're very often used interchangeably. And when we talk a little bit more about climate change, we can see why the IPCC, that's an intergovernmental panel on climate change, a global coalition of scientists really, why they've given us the recommendation to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, because the warming has lots of other effects. The warming means that we have more severe weather events. So for example, if we keep warming below 1.5 degrees, we're currently at about 0.7. Instead of 2 degrees, the effects will 2.5 times be worse, between 1.5 and 2 degrees warming. So we really want to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. The difference between climate change and global warming, yes, it is exactly, Sandy, what you say. It is climate change has extreme weather events. It can be more storms. It also is more rainfall in certain regions, because if it becomes warmer air can hold more water, which will come down again in really extreme rainfalls. That's why we have flooding events, but we also have more rain in certain areas. Unfortunately, not just in those areas that become drier because of more heat. So it's really changing, long-term change of weather patterns rather than it just becoming warmer. And that long-term change of the weather patterns also means we have loss of species. So between 1.5 and 2 degrees, just half a degree, will mean it's double the amount of species loss. So it's actually really important. It's sea ice free Arctic summers. We would have one in 100 years, and we would have one in 10 years. So that is why it's everyone is hammering down on those 1.5 degrees. There are things we can do about it, which is a good thing. So there is the Science-Based Target Initiative, and people set up targets to really keep warming below 1.5 degree. And that is also what the New Zealand government decided. We need to actually have a plan in place to really keep warming below 1.5 degrees. But it's also not just carbon. So there is carbon dioxide, CO2, there is methane, and we hear a lot about it. But there is also nitrous oxide, which happens if we put more fertilizer on land, for example. And then there are a number of industrial gases. And those would be used, for example, in air conditioning units. SF6 is a really potent, it's one of the most potent greenhouse gases. If you compare 1 kg of SF6 to 1 kg of CO2, it's about 26,000 times as potent. So we really do not want a leak of SF6, because that is quite significant. SF6 is used, for example, in switchgear and power stations. But what is in place in New Zealand is that everyone who actually has SF6 in some of their gear, they have to keep a register of it, so that we really can keep track of that. Now, you might have heard the term global warming potential. So if all those gases have all those different effects, how can we actually come up with one number? And that is what the IPCC, that group of scientists, have come up with. They've worked out methane is 28 times as strong as carbon with their global warming effect. So if we have a kilogram of methane, we have 28 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents. And that is how we can actually sum up the effects of all those different gases into kilograms of CO2 equivalents. So that is what is behind that. I think that's probably enough in terms of science. We also not only have different gases, we also have different sources on where they can come from. So we've got carbon from, specifically now talking about carbon dioxide. A lot of that comes from fossil carbon. So that would be our oil, our natural gas, it would be our coal. And then we have biogenic carbon. And biogenic carbon is interesting because that is the carbon that we would describe as being sequestered recently. So yes, fossil carbon might have come from plants, but that would be a million years ago and not affect our current global warming. Whereas biogenic carbon, the carbon has been taken out of the atmosphere in recent times. And if we release that back to the atmosphere, it has a net zero effect, which doesn't mean that all renewable energy like burning timber is 100% net zero, because we do need fossil fuels to actually cut those trees down. So it has a low carbon footprint, but not a zero carbon footprint if we would use wood for heating. And other sources of biogenic carbon would be, for example, methane from the digestion processes in a cow or a sheep. So we need to add up fossil carbon and biogenic carbon to have our total carbon footprint. But we usually communicate them separately, because one is the one that happened recently and the other one is that happened a long time ago. But we do have to consider them all into our total carbon footprint. That's possibly enough on the different sources of carbon. And now, what can we do as an organization? So we've heard the term carbon footprinting. And when we say carbon footprinting, it is always all greenhouse gases. Because I often get asked, so does it mean we only look at carbon dioxide? No, the term carbon footprint actually covers all greenhouse gases. The carbon-related ones, but also the industrial gases. And when we talk carbon footprint, there's still two options. We can do a carbon footprint of products, say a pair of shoes. And I've chosen the YY Nation shoes here because they're made out of wool. The top bit is out of wool and the bottom bit is out of recycled rubber. And we've actually calculated the carbon footprint of them. And it is very low. They're a New Zealand brand, by the way. I can send around a link later to the carbon footprint study that they've published. But that is what we would talk about, a product carbon footprint. It really is for one pair of sneakers. It's based on the full life cycle of a product, and there is a standard to follow. What I thought we focus a little bit more on today is the organizational carbon footprint. And that takes the full business into account, including the supply chain. So that means not only the products we produce, the energy we need for production, but it also is our marketing department. We might use a lot of paper. It will be our salespeople who travel around to sell our goods. It is all the raw materials we buy in, everything's included, but it doesn't break it down per product. So we always differentiate between a product and a corporate carbon footprint. Today, I won't talk so much about the product carbon footprint because the next session is LCA 101, and a product carbon footprint really is a subset of a full LCA. So we'll focus on that one next time and look into that corporate carbon footprint a little bit more. You might have heard the terms scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and maybe I'll explain them on the next slide. So scope 1 emissions really are the ones from sources that you control, your direct emissions. You own a vehicle, you buy petrol, you burn that petrol, and that is your own emission. You own a cow, the cow burps out methane, it's your direct emission. Scope 2 is indirect. It is related to the electricity that you purchase. Or if you were purchasing steam from another facility, then that would also be scope 2. It is the energy you use and someone else is burning the fuel. So that is your scope 2. And scope 3 is everything else. So if we, in our business, if we would purchase paper, or the services of a law firm, or the services of an accountant, that would be purchased goods and services. If you were a retailer, everything you buy in, even if you want to sell it, is your purchased goods and services. So that is your scope 3. Then if you build a building, if you have shipping towards your organization, business travel, employee commuting, all those things are your upstream scope 3. And downstream, if it is further processing, say you would produce just a flat metal sheet. No one really needs that. They would need a corrugated sheet for a roof. So that corrugation process is further processing of your product. It's part of your scope 3. If you would sell electrical goods, you'd have an influence on how much energy they use. So the use of those white goods would be your scope 3. Now, a lot of people go, well, but all of those scope 3 emissions are someone else's scope 1 and 2. Wouldn't they count them? So why do I have to? And the reason is that we have an influence on our scope 3 emissions by working with those people whose scope 1 and 2 emissions they are. And that is really where the power is. It's in that collaboration along the supply chain to bring the footprints down. And that is why scope 3 is really, really important. It might be easier in a way to measure and control your scope 1 and 2, but scope 3 is where you have the power to actually make change within your supply chain. On the next slide, we can see some of the relevant categories of scope 3 emissions for different sectors. It's really very different by sector. We are a services type business, so for us, our business travel is the biggest thing. And so that would be here in row 4, industrial goods and services. We're a bit similar to that. But if you were, for example, in healthcare, then your scope 1 and 2 are about a quarter, and half of it is purchased goods and services. If you were, however, in the utility sector, then the use of your sold goods. If you were selling gas, someone else is burning it, then that is your scope 3. Same in the construction industry, the use of the buildings is a lot of scope 3. So that is quite high. So it's really different per sector. We will be able to help organizations very soon with a bit of guidance on how to easily find out which of those categories actually are relevant for us to do that initial screening. Now, once you've worked out what your emission sources are, you can calculate your footprint. And I just thought I'd give you the example of our own footprint to show you how that would look like. Yes, they're all scope 3 categories. In total, there are 15 scope 3 categories. We can see that other scope 3 categories are, for example, your investments or franchises, or if you leased assets. So those would be the additional scope 3 categories that I didn't include in that next slide. If you were a bank, for example, you can almost ignore all of your other emissions and it's all in your investments. Because you can make choices. You can invest in a coal mine, or you could make the decision not to invest in a coal mine, and that will have quite a significant impact on your scope 3, but that is where you can drive your impact as well. For ourselves, business travel, before we started doing what we're doing right now, traveling by car, business travel was 61%. That is largely me flying up and down the country. 13% is employee commuting, so that was all pre-COVID. That will be a lot less now as well, because we have people working only a few days in the office. So we're just waiting for our results for 20. We've done those, and 21 to see what the impact really was. And from the sneak preview that I did get a few weeks ago is that our business travel has gone down significantly. Our electricity has gone up a bit because we've doubled in size, but still our overall footprint has gone down. You can see here that we also have set a target for our emissions. We can see here the long sticks out are our current emissions, and then we want to bring it back by about half by 2030, because we've set ourselves a science-based target. And a science-based target, looping it back right to the beginning, makes sure that the emissions that an organization has will enable us to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. And that is where it's not just a reduction target, but a science-based reduction target. So that is where the science-based target initiative comes in. Not everyone has to start with a science-based target. What is really important is to get started and to start measuring your carbon footprint and then set a reduction target. That would bring me to the end of my slides, and I'm quite happy to take a few questions.
Thank you, Barbara. That was a great run through, and that was probably a perfect ending, because a question would be, where would you recommend a company start? Where do you think that they sort of, where would you recommend they start?
Trying to calculate a full footprint, and I always go broad and really identify which are all of the scope 3 categories that are relevant. And I would start really with that rather than going, I'll just pick a few of the scope 3 ones. Because if you identify all the scope 3 ones that are relevant, then you might not go into detail in all of them, but you actually get a good understanding of where in your supply chain does the carbon actually sit. So I think it's really more important to get it roughly right than perfect, but very, very limited. So I'd go scope 1, relatively easy. You know what you buy, you know what types of fuel you buy and you burn. Scope 2, again, relatively straightforward. Everyone pays for their electricity and there is an emission factor. And then scope 3, we will have a tool to help screening which scope 3 categories really are relevant. That's coming out very, very soon. I'll share that with you. And I would also say MFE have really good guidance documents. They help with that. They even have an Excel sheet that people can use. And it's reasonably straightforward to use. They've got a quick guide on how to get started. We actually reviewed some of those, and they're quite good. They're really good to get started. And if you get stuck, there are people around who can help. I might add that we can do that too. But the guidance from MFE is a really good starting point.
And just further from that, what area, bearing in mind this is focused around the plastics industry and a number on this will be in manufacturing. What decarbonisation routes do you think can have the most impact?
It's really, really dependent on the type of industry. But if you, for example, had a lot of air freight, then I know it's not necessarily an option to bring it all to ships or container ships. But if you have an opportunity to lightweight your products, you'll really reduce the impact of air freight as well. So that could be one. Choosing feedstock could be an option because of the purchased goods and services. If energy use is one of the key contributors, then looking at electricity use, we already have our electricity mix in New Zealand is already 85% renewable, but it is possible, and now we get into real detail, that is beyond Carbon 101, that's a 301 already. For Scope 2 reporting, you can report on your location, which is New Zealand, so 85 or whatever it is percent renewable electricity. But you can go to market-based because you can purchase renewable energy certificates, which mean your electricity carbon footprint would come down to 0. And if you have a huge electricity bill, that actually might make quite a bit of impact. It depends really which category is most contributing.
Are there guidelines around what the scope of GHG emissions for category 11?
That is really for those products that consume energy during their use. And because as a manufacturer, you'll be able to make your products very energy efficient or less energy efficient. So it's a use of sold goods. For a fridge, for example, it's the energy the fridge would use over its expected lifetime. Another example is we did do the carbon footprint for Lord's solar power album. And the use phase of that was to actually download the songs. We did it for the download version of her album. And downloading the songs from the cloud actually does use quite a bit of greenhouse gases because of the power the data centers use. So all those aspects would be taken into account.
Does the Science Based Targets Initiative require companies to reduce GHGs across all scopes, 1, 2, and 3? Or can specific scopes be ignored if they're just small contributors?
That is a good question. So yes, generally all scopes are included. Scope 3 has to be in if it contributes over 40% of your carbon footprint. So if it is really only scope 1 and 2 what you have, then you don't have to do scope 3. I haven't really come across a business where that would apply though. And the reduction for scope 1 and 2 needs to be in line with 1.5 degrees. For scope 3, it can be well below 2 degrees. So it's not quite as strict, but it does need to be included.
And look, as we're talking sort of, all things carbon today, in your mind, what's the hierarchy around, carbon, recycling, waste? Like, where do you think it's?
That's a tricky one. I don't think there is one, really. I don't think there is one. What I would say is carbon is absolutely relevant for everyone. There are businesses for where waste might not be such a high priority, but it really depends on what type of business it is. Like for us as a services organization, waste, what do we have? We don't have much, right? We have a bit of office waste. We use secondhand laptops already, so otherwise we would have e-waste as well, or more e-waste. But for us, carbon definitely is a big thing. But if you're a large user of materials, then material use is just as important. And what I would say, I think carbon is a really good place to start, but keep in mind that however you optimize carbon, to at least not have a negative impact on any of the other ones. So, because that can happen too. So if we can't improve on all, let's just make sure that if we improve one of the categories, if you like, we don't have a negative impact on any of the others.
We've reached our time for today. Thank you. Thank you so much, Barbara, for making time.
So good.
Sitting down and touring. We really, really appreciate it. And I think, PNZ, maybe Sandy or Kelly, the team can maybe circulate one of those calculators that one of the spreadsheets you're referring to as well for anyone that wants to start their journey. Nice to see everyone today. Thank you so much for your time, Barbara, and for your insights.
Thank you.
Looking forward to seeing everyone in a couple of weeks' time.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.